The Soviet soldiers' startling reaction upon entering Germany in 1945. January 12, 1945. On the Eastern Front, one of the most intense offensives of the Second World War has just begun. The operation, known as the Odor, involved over 2 million Red Army soldiers being thrown on a completely destroyed German army that was powerless to stop the Soviet onslaught. Stalin's forces were fewer than 70 kilometers from Berlin at the end of January 1945, marking the end of the Vistala onslaught. It is estimated that between 8 and 10 million German civilians fled in a desperate attempt to escape the Soviet soldiers toward Berlin. The flight was completely disorganized, and with temperatures reaching 20 degrees below zero, many of them perished from cold exhaustion, hunger, or bombardment. This was the first time that the Red Army soldiers entered the original borders of the Third Reich, and panic struck the German people for the first time. The hands of Soviet troops who, as soon as they stepped foot in East Prussia, erupted into an unquenchable desire for blood and retribution. Without delving into all the crimes and atrocities that occurred here, which we will see in a live program shortly, we will examine how the Red Army soldiers responded when they arrived. One of the biggest paradoxes of those times, which has gone largely unnoticed, is unquestionably what we are about to witness in German society and its way of life. It all began when the frontline troops were arriving in Germany and they suddenly realized that urbanism was very different. After seeing the enormous, well-maintained homes in the region, most of which had lovely gardens, they had been persuaded for years that the Soviet Union was a paradise for workers and peasants. The Soviets promptly started destroying and burning them because they thought they were the homes of rich German lords. They also destroyed everything they discovered inside. Gradually, they came to the conclusion that there couldn't have been so many barons in Germany because the great majority of the homes they saw shared these traits, but this didn't stop the destruction. Everything in East Prussia was on fire as well. So much so that, when night fell, the soldiers had very little place to go to protect themselves from the cold. It was later discovered that, in addition to their animosity toward the Germans, this destruction was also done to prevent the Soviet rear guard troops and their senior officers from capturing or seizing it. When they arrived at their posts, they were referred to as the General Staff's vermin, the rear vermin, despite the fact that most homes in their home countries were constructed of wood, but in this country, every home was made of brick and stone, had a garden full of well-kept hedges, and had first-rate roads all around. The Soviets were also taken aback by the sheer number of pianos they discovered in almost every home, as well as the widespread radio sets. These factors all contributed to an increasing amount of jealousy, confusion, rage, and admiration for the Germans that was almost uncontrollable, and they also felt betrayed by their own. Leaders quickly realized that many of the things they had been told were false, but, because of their desire for vengeance against the Germans, the question that many Red Army soldiers asked themselves, and documented in writing, was why these well-off Germans had invaded our nation. There is just suffering in comparison to theirs. How are we going to treat these Germans? A Soviet soldier asked. They have everything they need, including abundant food, decent homes, animals, and apple orchards. They even invaded my city, which is more than 1,000 kilometers away. Captain, we should strangle them all as planned just for that. The Soviet Army's ideological section quickly took notice of various postal center reports alerting them to the fact that troops were sending numerous letters to their families explaining the disparity and the quality of life. Even though these soldiers didn't mean any harm, it was obvious that the information they were sending home might be interpreted politically incorrectly. As a result, postal censorship departments had to put in extra effort to conceal all of the information the soldiers were sending. As an anecdote, we must mention that the soldiers' lack of paper forced them to use postcards and papers they stole from German homes, which contained many of the communist slogans on the folios. As a result, the Soviet High Command tried to send paper to the soldiers so they could write and that such incidents would not happen again. The Soviet authorities' response to the millions of captives they were releasing from their state, which had been under German control during their advance in 1941 and 1942, was another essential element of this story. The group of Soviets who ended up in German land was quite diverse. There were forced laborers, prisoners of war, and, finally, Soviets fighting alongside the Germans. Of these, the most were shot immediately, but the other two were not spared many punishments. In fact, many of them testified that the treatment they received from the Germans had been extremely harsh, but that the treatment they received from their own countrymen was even worse. They were accused of being traitors, deserters, collaborators, and a host of other offenses. Some combative men were even included in the Red Army's formation. Despite this, they were arrested and questioned once more after the battle, and many of them were sent to concentration camps along with the soldiers who had already been sent after being accused of being traitors. The Soviet women who were held as prisoners were also treated in a manner that was quite similar to that of the Germans themselves. This suggests that, on the one hand, the situation for the Germans at this time was the direst they had ever encountered in the entire war, as waves of millions of people were desperately making their way towards the interior of its borders. They brought with them a few material possessions and their heartbreaking testimonies, despite the fact that many German defeats had been concealed from the populace. As is common in all nations when things are going badly, this disaster could not be stopped, even though the news stated that fighting was occurring in Warsaw. Surroundings in actuality, the front line had been entirely circumvented during the initial stages of the onslaught. The Soviet armored columns moved tens of kilometers per day in the direction of Berlin, and nothing could stop them once these refugees started to arrive, bringing with them tales of the magnificent Soviet atrocities against children, youth, adults, and the elderly, as well as all of their property, had to be made public. There was no other option than to formally disseminate these stories and educate the populace about what would happen to them if they were unable to escape the situation. He fought with the possibility of dying, or he would undoubtedly die if he turned himself into the Soviets, as Stalin did in the summer of 1942 with his well-known Order No. 227, which was titled, "Not One Step Back." Hitler, who had been appointed commander of the Vistala army group, had to issue an order. Similar to the German troops, this order was named "Death and Punishment of Those Who Do Not Do Their Duty." Ultimately, after suffering significant losses in both military and civilian casualties, the Germans were able to establish a relatively stable front at the height of the Odor River by mid-February, in anticipation of the last Soviet onslaught. As of right now, this program has shown us what the initial cultural clash meant for the Soviet soldiers who came to Germany. If you would like to see the full military evolution of this offensive, I will leave you with this program in the description that we examined a few months ago. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on the subject.